The man, with his extraordinarily beautiful appearance, had long dominated the king's life. His actions angered the young prince. George was well aware that in order to maintain his position in the palace in the future, he must form a good relationship with the prince, as the elderly king would eventually age. Therefore, he took Prince Charles to Spain for a marriage alliance. It was evident that the princess was very satisfied with Charles, and the two exchanged glance, clearly smitten with each other. If this marriage were to succeed, George would still have influence in the palace after the king's death. He initially believed that this marriage was almost guaranteed. However, at the negotiating table, Spain presented a condition. Charles must convert to Catholicism in order to marry the princess. This demand was, of course, impossible, as England had long adhered to Protestantism. As a result, the negotiations ended in failure. Charles was greatly disappointed and frankly said that if George's mother were present, there would certainly be a solution. It was precisely these words that struck George's fragile nerves. He was eager to prove that he could succeed without relying on his mother. So, he secretly approached the Spanish ambassador, hoping to secure the marriage through bribery. But this wasn't England, and George's methods didn't work here. The ambassador's comment about him being a child further broke him down. George felt insulted and threatened the ambassador, vowing to make him pay the price. Arrogant George wants to bring Charles back to England, and Charles was completely confused. He could have married the princess, so why were they returning? Unless George told him the truth, Charles refused to leave. In order to make Charles obey his arrangements, George lied, claiming the ambassador had called him a coward unworthy of the princess. Charles, who had been ridiculed and mocked since childhood, would not stand for it this time. So, they rushed back to England. George did not expect his mother to be at the palace. Before they could speak, the king had already guessed something. This wouldn't have been an issue, but George had Charles recount how they had been insulted. George's intentions were clear. He wanted to wage war against Spain. Unsurprisingly, they were expelled from the palace, marking the first time the king had rejected George. George, unable to tolerate this humiliation, refused to let the matter end there. He took the ailing king to the outskirts, where he had his own methods to make the king compromise. Seeing George's careful arrangement, the king couldn't help but be moved. Although his health was poor, he still desired to experience one last indulgence. In the end, George persuaded the king to send troops to war. Meanwhile, Charles, afraid, went to find Mary. Mary had him recount everything that had happened in Spain. The king once again fell under George's sway, but Mary was far from happy. She had already understood the situation, which meant that the upcoming war would bring destruction. But the king remained in the dark. Mary advised her son not to wage war for personal gain, but George was not listening. He disregarded Mary's warnings and made a speech in favor of war at the council meeting, even hanging dissenting ministers. By the time Mary found the king, it was too late. The king was still lost in the comforting illusion created by George. Mary revealed the truth, explaining that George's impulsiveness and arrogance had ruined the negotiations, and that he had waged war to save face. The king, of course, did not believe her. As a mother, Mary had no need to oppose George. It was too late now. They had already declared war on Spain. That night, the king, in a fit of rage, accused George of being a traitor, a villain who had ruined everything. His whole life had been devoted to peace. But now, George had blinded him, destroying everything. Despite Mary's pleas, the king was resolute. He decided to strip George of all his titles and wealth, and soon, he would personally send George to the gallows. The king became more agitated as he spoke and fainted from the stress. Charles, intending to stay by the king's side during this crisis, but George sent him to find the royal physician. Fearing the king would wake up and give Charles the same orders, George strangled the king in front of his mother. By the time Charles arrived with the physician, the king had already passed. Mary left the palace that night. To get George into power, she had done many wrong things, but she never imagined her son would turn out this way. Now that things were set in motion, Mary was disheartened. After the old king died, Charles ascended the throne. Under George's persuasion, he still chose war. The prolonged battles caused suffering among the soldiers, and tens of thousands died in this drawn-out conflict. In the end, George didn't escape either. People slowly discovered the truth behind the war. George was publicly stabbed to death by an officer in the barracks. When a servant reported the news to Mary, she was not surprised, as she had already foreseen her son's fate. After George's death, Mary's family did not fall into decline. Relying on the connections she had built, she remained firmly established in the aristocratic circle. Her eldest son, John, married the daughter of a judge, and she was now pregnant. Although her second son, George, had died, his wife was the daughter of the prime minister. Their son inherited George's titles and property. They had gone through so much, yet it seemed as though nothing had changed. Mary was still the respected Countess of Buckingham.